Hi everyone, this is Jason Taylor from Radiant Training, where we focus on delivering IT training specifically around software engineering, DevOps, and cloud computing. Today, in this video, I'm going to show you how I install and set up Git on a new Windows 10 PC. For some of you, this video is going to be optional, perhaps very optional. I want to include all the steps I go through to set up my Windows system with Git and related tools. You are welcome to skip this video entirely if you prefer to go it alone. Just keep in mind, if you follow my other videos that cover Git topics, your system may be set up somewhat differently. However, this is how I have Git set up on my system, and it serves as a baseline for all my Git courses, tutorials, and Git-related videos or live streams. And for this video in particular, this is a long format consolidated video instead of each part on its own. However, I will provide timecodes in the description below since not everyone will want to watch all parts of this video. If you want, see my video on Windows 10 Setup and Common Tools, which is my starting point for this video. Basically, it is a fresh install with Chrome, Windows Terminal, and a few text editors already installed. Finally, I will have links to any resources in the description below. In particular, I will include a link to a written set of instructions for those interested. Okay. Are you still with me? If so, then I'm truly sorry. Let's get on with it. In this video, we're going to go over how to download and install Git for Windows, including the settings I normally use. For the most part, I will accept the defaults, but there are a few exceptions. One thing I'd like to point out is that the installer for Git for Windows does periodically change. I generally recommend accepting the defaults on any new screens or options. After Git for Windows is installed, I will adjust the Git Bash terminal program to be easier to read on my screen. This is particularly good for those not using Windows Terminal. After that, I will integrate Git Bash with the Windows Terminal program. If you don't plan to use Windows Terminal, you may skip this part of the video. Since Windows Terminal supports multiple tabs, it has become my favorite way to use Git and the Bash shell. Then I will set up the Bash environment to use a special script called Git prompt to streamline the terminal prompt while using Git. Again, the default prompt is perfectly fine, but I prefer things a bit more streamlined, so this is completely optional. With all the terminal programs set up, we will look at how to get help using Git, both from the command line and online. Once we have learned how to get help, specifically about the config subcommand, let's use that command to configure Git with some initial settings, like name and email address. We will also take a few moments to set up a few other settings too, while we are here. And finally, we will set up a visual diff and merge tool called P4Merge. If you plan to use a standalone visual merge tool, this is pretty much the best tool that is both free and cross-platform that offers a three-way merge visualization, which is important when attempting to do complex merges. While it is optional, it can be pretty handy to have. Well, that sums up the intro section. Now let's get on with the demos. Alright, now let's install Git for Windows. Alright, I'm currently back to my Windows desktop. Let's start by opening our web browser. Let's go to the official Git website at git-sem.org. Once there, the homepage should detect that you're on Windows and present a Download for Windows button. Click on that button, and after a few moments, the Git for Windows installer should be downloaded. I'm going to go ahead and launch the installer. course, I'll be prompted. I'll go ahead and accept the license. The setup path is just fine. On the components to install, I do want to add the desktop icon, so I check that option. This is fine. On this page, I like to select Nano as my default text editor. So I'm going to drop down, and then I need to go up and select the top item, which is Nano. If you want to leave it as Vim, you certainly can. Next. This is a relatively new screen, and it might go away in the near future. For now, I'll leave it at the default. Let Git decide. Regarding the path environment, I recommend the middle option, which is default. So go ahead to Next. For this page, I want to use the OpenSSL library. So we'll do that. We'll keep the default. On this page, I do want to vary from the default. The top here is to let Git change the line endings to match Windows style. But if you work on any team that has multiple platforms involved, then it's best to sort of coalesce onto the Unix-based line endings. So I'll do that. I'll pick the middle option, which will check out as is, but commit into the Unix style. Next. This page is about the terminal emulator, and we'll keep the default, min-tty. Again, here we'll keep the default, which is a fast-forward based merge. For the credentials helper, choose the default. And on this page, we'll keep the defaults that are checked and anything that's unchecked as is. If you have an experimental page like this, then just leave it as the default, which is unchecked. Once you've reached the end of the wizard, you can click on Install to do the actual installation of Git. All right, once we've reached the end of the installation wizard, go ahead and uncheck this. We don't need to launch that for right now. And click on Finish to close the installer. And for now, we can go ahead and close our web browser. All right, while we're here, we'll do a few things. Make sure we have our desktop icon, which we do. But I also want to add this to the toolbar and the Start menu. Right-click, pin to Start, repeat, and then pin to Taskbar. Great, so now it should show up down here in the bottom. Once we're in the Start menu, we can move this up into our Tools grouping. Well, let's go ahead and launch Git Bash right quick and see what it looks like. Oh wow, that's incredibly small. Well, let's do a quick version. Type git version. I'll zoom in so that you can see this, and then press Enter. All right, Git should respond with the version of Git that is installed. And we can close out. Great, now that we've installed Git for Windows, let's make a few tweaks to our Bash terminal to make it look a little bit more presentable. I'm currently back on my Windows desktop. We've just installed Git for Windows. However, since I'm on a high-resolution display, if I launch Git Bash, you can see that it is very small, at least relative to the rest of my screen. So let's make a few adjustments to that. With Git Bash open, you can right-click anywhere on the Windows title bar. Then go to Options on the pop-up menu. That brings up our Options dialog for Git Bash. Let's start with text. Once on the text page, go under Font, and then click Select. I want to use a slightly different font, so let's go up here and find Consolus. Then let's increase the size of the font to size 30. This is a size that I have determined works pretty well on my screen. Now, feel free to play around to find the font size that works well for yours. I'm going to click Apply. That should instantaneously resize our Bash terminal program. Let's go ahead and click OK. Now, let's go to Window. Click on Window, and then with the window settings, I want to change the default size for the columns and the rows. For a size 30 font on my screen, I can get away with 150 columns. By 40 rows. All right, great. Click Apply and then Save. In order for our settings to take effect, we need to close Git Bash and restart it. Great, it looks like Git Bash is set up in a more readable way. Let's go ahead and close out. All right, while I'm here, I want to go ahead and set up Windows Terminal to use Git Bash. Now, this is optional, so if you don't plan on using Windows Terminal, then you can skip ahead. Back at my Windows desktop, I already have Windows Terminal installed. So I'll go ahead and launch that. And right now, PowerShell comes up as the default, which is fine, but I want to use the newly installed Git Bash instead. To do that, we can use the drop-down to access the settings. Once on the settings page, we need to add a new profile. So go under Profiles and click on Add New. For the name, we can use Git Bash. For the command, let's click on Browse. And now we need to navigate to where we have Git installed on our system, which is typically under the C drive, then Program Files, then Git. Once here, there is a specific executable we need to use. Go under the bin directory and simply select Bash. This will be the Bash executable that will be invoked every time we launch this profile. Go ahead and click Open. Now, before we move on, there are a few adjustments we need to make. So go to the end of the command line, put your cursor at the very end, right after the .ext extension, and now we need a space. We need to add a couple of options. First, we'll do --cd -to-home. Now another space, --login. Another space, -i. The first option will tell Bash to go to the user's home directory. The next one will use the Bash login script. And the last one is an interactive shell. All right, let's continue. Next, let's update our icon. Let's give this the icon that came with Git. So let's navigate to our Git installation directory. Now within here, we need to go to this folder, which represents the actual runtime. Then go into Share. Then into the Git directory. Within here, there should be a Git for Windows icon. Select that file and then click on Open. Tab title can be just about anything. We'll just use Git Bash for now. With everything on the general page filled out, let's go to Appearance. Let's go to Font Size and increase this to 30. Now, you might want to play around with the font size to match your screen the best. All right, with everything done, let's go ahead and save this profile. All right. Finally, one last thing. While we're here, let's go back up to Startup and change the default profile to Git Bash. Great. That will make it so whenever I start up Windows Terminal, it automatically launches Git Bash for me. Let's go ahead and save our changes and close Windows Terminal so that we can try it out fresh. All right, so now let's launch Windows Terminal. If we do everything correctly, we should launch into Git Bash. And we can verify that by using our git command. And if you're not fully convinced we're running within Git Bash, there's another command we can use. uname space -a. Press enter. This pretty much confirms that we're running within the Git Bash environment. All right, now we can safely close. There's one more customization that I want to do to my terminal settings, and that is to install a script called git prompt. Now, this is optional, especially on Windows, since all the main information is already displayed for you while in your Git repositories. However, I still think this is more streamlined while also conveying all the same information. So it's worth setting up. All right, back at my desktop, I'm going to launch my web browser. And I have a special GitHub organization set up for all my training classes. Go to github.com/Taylor-training-courses. Find the repo named Installations. Click into that. Once in that repo, you should land on the main branch. Now, let's go into Windows, then Git. And here we'll find a README file, which is already rendered out. We want to find the section called Git Prompt, which is down here. In particular, if we read down through here, we see there are a handful of commands. These commands will make it pretty easy to install the Git prompt as well as supporting scripts. This again assumes that we're starting with a brand new install. So if you have existing files, please make sure you back them up. I don't need to back anything up because I'm starting completely fresh and these files don't exist for me yet. So I'm going to fire open Git Bash. And I should be in my home directory. So let's confirm that. See, pwd says print working directory. And at least in terms of how Git Bash represents things, I'm in my home directory, which is under the C drive, under users, and then my name. If I do an ls-al, I can see I have a list of files and folders here. All right. Let's go back to our browser. And I want to copy the first line here. Just select that line, then copy. We head back over to Git Bash. Now, one thing to keep in mind, let me clear my screen to return to the top. One thing to keep in mind is if you're using Git Bash, the terminal Git Bash, then you need to use Shift Insert to do your paste. We double check that and then press enter. That downloaded the Git prompt script from the official Git repo. All right, let's bounce back to our web browser. And we'll do the same for the next line down. This will download a version of my bash RC script. Shift insert. And then press enter. One more time. We'll do this for the bash profile. Copy. And now shift insert. All right. Let's open our current directory with a text editor. I'm going to use Visual Studio Code. Code and then period. All right, now I'm going to find those new files that we just added. Here I have the .git prompt. If we open that up, you can see this is a fairly large script. There's really nothing to do here, just keep it the way it is. Next, we'll look at the bash RC file. This does a few things. It sets up our coloring scheme for Windows. It creates an alias because I always type LL. And this is where the real magic is. This is where we set up the get prompt, assuming that that script actually exists. If it does, it's going to source it and then use the function within it. All right, let's go to the bash profile. This simply just loads the bash RC file. This is a fairly common technique. All right, we're going to close out of Visual Studio Code or whatever text editor you're using. And now once we're back to our terminal, let's go ahead and exit out. And at this point, we can close our web browser. All right, let's try this out. Open up Git Bash. And our prompt should be very different now. Let's try using that alias, LL. All right, and it looks like we have a new coloring scheme. If we want, we can double check to make sure this all works in the Windows terminal as well. So I'll close out and then launch Windows Terminal. And it's set up. So Windows Terminal is using Git Bash under the hood, which means it executes all our scripts as we log in. Now, Windows Terminal will render the fonts and the colors slightly differently, but it's not that big of a deal. All right, we can exit out now. All right, now that we have everything set up and ready to go, let's start working with Git just a little bit by looking at our Git version, which we've already done basically, and more importantly, how to get help using Git, both through the command line and online. I'm starting off on my Windows desktop, and at this point, I can either choose to use Git Bash or Windows Terminal. From now on, basically, if I say we're going to use the terminal program, what I mean is either one of these. So I'm going to use Windows Terminal since I like the tabbing capabilities. All right, with that open, let's do a Git version. And of course, that simply outputs the version of Git that's currently installed. No big deal, we've already done that, but now we have this nice big screen to show that off. Well, what about other Git commands? Well, we can ask Git for help about itself. We can use the -- help option without any other arguments, and we should get something back. We scroll back up, we can see we get help about how to use the git command. And it provides several of these subcommands that we could add to the help command. So let's try that. So we'll use the help subcommand, so it'd be git help, followed by whatever it is that you want help on. So one of the commands we'll be using soon will be the config command. So let's get help about that. So git help space config. Once we press enter, we'll be prompted to actually launch our web browser. Now, this is a behavior that is unique to Windows. This does not happen on Mac or Linux. You'll get a man page instead. We'll choose our web browser of choice. I'm going to use Google Chrome. And then say always for this particular invocation. Hit OK. As you can see, once Chrome launches, we go to a manual style page, but through a web browser. And you can tell by the path, this is actually not on the internet. This is from our local installation. All right, let's take a few moments to review the information that's here. The man pages typically have a description that tell you what the command's about, as well as the common options to go with it. All right, let's close out. Back at the terminal, I'll show you another way to get to the same place. Git followed by the actual subcommand you want to use, which is config, space, and then -- help option. This is exactly the same thing. Once again, the git config man page loads. And we can combine this syntax to get help about help. So git help, so help is the subcommand. And then we'll do the -- help option off the subcommand. Great. Now we have our man page for git help. Let's go ahead and close out. Basically, you can use either the first syntax or the second syntax. All right, now let's look at getting help online. For now, let's close out of the terminal. Let's go ahead and invoke our web browser and go to git-sem.org. I believe .com works too. So once on the home page, you can go to documentation. Once there, go to reference. And this provides you a list of all the things that Git is able to do. Under setup and config will be our familiar config command. So let's click into that. You'll notice this is slightly different than the man page that we had before, although a lot of the same information is still here. What I like about this page, though, you can actually go back in history and see the status of this command as of a particular version of Git. So, for example, if you're running an older version, say that you work for an enterprise that locks down specific versions of tools that you have installed, then you can go to that command's help page as of that particular version. For the most part, a lot of the information you'll want is available on the official Git website, although the documentation can be a little intense to read at times. So I like to look up this information after I've gotten pretty familiar with how Git works. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close my web browser, and we're off to the next video. Before we can do any serious work with Git, we need to provide at least a minimal configuration. And of course, while we're here, I'll add in a few more common settings that I like to use. All right, before we get started, I'd like to point out that there are 3 levels of configuration with Git. When we went through the installation process, those settings were saved at the installation level. That is the system level. So regardless of what users log in, so if I have multiple users on this system, all those users will get those settings as the starting point. Now, those settings can be overridden from a user perspective. That's what Git calls a global configuration. So it sounds a little backwards that the more global setting is not called global. It's actually a system setting. And that the user level setting is called global. Now there is one level more called local, which is basically configuration settings that are saved with the repository itself once we start getting into that. For the most part, you're going to want to save most of your settings at the global or user level. So let's do that. Open your terminal. And once there, I want to point out that the file that is used is called .gitconfig. If I do ll, if I look around, I should notice that there isn't a .gitconfig file yet. And that's okay. Once we use the git config commands, Git will automatically take care of that for us. Let's start with the 2 minimal configuration settings first, the user's name and the user's email address. We'll start with the git config command, or you can call it the git command with the config subcommand. I'll refer to them interchangeably from time to time. All right, git config space -- global. If you leave this off, the default is for the local repo. But since we haven't created any repos, we would just get an error message. So we do need to specify -- global, so this setting is saved at the user's git config file. Now, let's specify the setting that we wish to set. User.name. Now, I like to use double quotes for any setting that would contain special characters or spaces within it. Double quote. I put my first and last name. All right. With that setting set up, let's go ahead and press enter. Now let's set the next setting. Git config -- global user.email. Again, surrounding with double quotes. I'm going to use my email address at my radiant.training domain. Of course, you want to use your actual email address. Otherwise, there's really not much point. Great. Now, how do we know that Git has this setting? Well, let's just ask for it. Git config space -- global. And here we can pass in the option -- list. This will list out any of our global configurations. Great. Git tells us that we have 2, user.name and user.email, with their settings accordingly. Well, let's see where this file actually is. If I do an ll, if I look at my listing of files and folders here, I should now see a .gitconfig file. All right, great. let's use the cat command to output the entire contents of that file to the terminal. You can use tilde to represent your user's home directory, which means this command will work from anywhere on your system. / and then the file, which is .gitconfig. So here we have the contents of our .gitconfig file. It actually looks very similar to a Windows INI file. So if you're familiar with what that format looks like, we have these sections, which are denoted by the brackets and the section name, and then the individual settings per section. Depending on what text editors you might have installed, we can also open this file directly with our favorite text editor. So Atom, which is an installed text editor, and then I specify my path to the .gitconfig file. And Atom opens with the .gitconfig file. I'm going to close Atom. And now let's try this with Visual Studio Code, which should work identically. Yep, same thing. So Visual Studio Code loads the .gitconfig file as I specified. I needed to specify the text editor to open the .gitconfig file because Git is still configured to use Nano as the default editor, and we can confirm that. Git config -- global -e. The -e option tells Git to use its default editor to load the Git config file. As expected, Nano is launched when we specified the -e. If you're not familiar with Nano, you can use Control-X to exit. Well, what if I don't want to use Nano as the default core editor for Git commands? Well, we can change that with a git config command. Git space config space -- global, then the setting core.editor. Then within quotes, the actual command to execute. Now, as long as the command is available on your system path, you don't need to specify the full path to the executable. So I'm just going to say Atom, followed by some options. -w. The -w will tell Atom to wait before returning. All right, I'm going to go ahead and press enter. And now let's try it out. So we arrow up, we can go back to the previous command with the -e, and let's see how Git responds. Great. So Git launches Atom as its default editor now. And now we see a new version of our .gitconfig file, now including a core section with an item called editor. If we wanted to, we could actually edit this directly. So what if I don't want to use Atom? Instead, I want to use Visual Studio Code. Turns out that the command is nearly identical. We just switch it out for code with -w option. All right, just save the file and then exit out of Atom. Let's try it one more time. Git config -- global -e. And now this time, Visual Studio Code is launched. So you can see there are actually multiple ways to add configuration to Git. You can add it through the command line, like we did earlier, or you can simply edit the .gitconfig file directly. All right, let's go ahead and close out. And I'm going to clear up and we can proceed to the next setting. So we just set the minimum required configuration for Git to be productive. Technically, we could use Git without those settings, but we couldn't do any commits or anything like that until we set those values. So now there's a few other things I want to set. One is called the default push, and we'll get to know that a little bit better later on. Since Git 2.0, the default push operation has changed to a setting called simple. However, even after the 2.0 arrived, Git continues to badger people about this setting. Apparently, it's a pretty big deal, so they just wanted to make sure that folks knew about it, but there's an easy way to turn that notification off. We can pretty much turn off that warning by setting simple for our default push. So push.default. And then we'll just use simple. I'm not using double quotes in here because it's one word. So if we cat our .gitconfig, we see that we have a new section called push with an item called default set to simple. All right, there is one last setting that I want to set, and this is actually a relatively new setting. So starting in Git version 2.28, Git added the ability to change the default branch name. Now this is part of the gradual move to changing the default branch from the name master to main. But in the interim, until we can fully move over, Git added the ability to manually set that. First of all, we need to make sure we have the right version of Git. So if I do a Git version, of course, it tells me that I'm using 2.31, and of course, some minor patch version. That is, of course, greater than 2.28. So we're good to go. So next, what we'll do is set the setting for our default. Now, right now, the default is actually master, which is set at the system level, which is part of the default things that we went through. It is still considered master at this time. Now, that may change in the future, which is one of the reasons why I had you accept the default while doing the installation. But let's change that on a per user basis. Git config -- global init dot default branch with a capital B. Make sure you use that. And then the name of the branch you wish to use as the default branch. And this is just the default branch is simply the first branch you actually start using. So all Git repos have to have a branch. That's the default branch, is the first one you start with. So you can call it main, you can call it production, you can keep calling it master if you want, you can call it develop, whatever you want. Bob's your uncle, whatever you want to put here. I think main actually makes the most sense, and that's where I'm going to stay with. All right, let's check this out. Git config -- global -e. And this is the current state of all of our settings. Go ahead and close out and exit the terminal. All right, now let's install P4Merge and integrate it with Git. To be fair, this is very optional. I like to stick with the two-way merge tool built into most of the text editors these days. But for more complex merges, a dedicated visual merge tool is pretty nice. So we'll do that. Back on the Windows desktop, let's open up our web browser. I'm going to open up two tabs here. First tab is we'll go back to that Git repo that had instructions that we can follow. To go to the github.com/tailor-training-courses and back into the installations repo. Once there, go into Windows, then Git. On the README file, we can scroll down until we find the section for P4Merge. All right, great. Should be down here towards the bottom. Now we do have a nice link to the website directly to the P4Merge tool on the Perforce website. If I do that, I can open in a new tab, and it takes me directly to the correct location. This might not always work because Perforce changes their website on a pretty regular basis. So let's see how we can get there. It's at perforce.com because that's the name of the company that actually builds this tool. They actually have a competing source control tool called Perforce or Helix that is an alternative to Git, but it's more of an older style centralized system. But they do have some pretty amazing Git integration tools, so those are worth a look. To go to perforce.com. Once their website loads, you want to find something to like a downloads page or something of that nature. So up here towards the top right now, at least according to their current layout of their website, we have a nice downloads link, so we can click on that. Now, somewhere on this page, there should be a visual merge tool, or in parentheses, P4Merge. Let me go ahead and get rid of this robot. All right. So here we are, Helix Visual Merge Tool. That's basically what they're calling P4Merge these days. So click on that. And that brings us to the same downloads page we had before. Once on this page, select your operating system. Then select platform. I know that I'm on a 64-bit version of Windows, so I'll choose that. And apparently there are multiple versions I can choose from. All right. I know that this first one will work, so I will go with that one. Then click on download. You don't technically need to fill out this registration information. It's just so they can send you information about their products. So I'm going to skip. Doing so should automatically begin the download of the installer. Go ahead and close out of that. Once the installer has finished downloading, just run the installer. All right. So despite this being specifically a download for P4Merge, what actually happens is that you download the installer for the entire suite. And of course, we don't want that. We just want the merge tool. So we will uncheck everything except for the merge and diff tool. So once we have isolated everything to only the merge and diff tool, click on next. Now click install. Of course, we'll be prompted. Once the installation has completed, click on exit. And now we can close this tab. Now what we need to do is, first we need to verify the path to our P4Merge tool. So it's under Program Files, Perforce. So let's go double check that. Open up Windows Explorer. Let me see, where is it? There we go. This PC, C drive, Program Files, then a folder called Perforce. Yep, looks like it's here. And there's the executable. All right, we can close out of this now. I just want to make sure that that indeed did exist. So these are the commands we want to run. And this will tell Git to configure our external diff tool and external merge tool to be P4Merge. So we'll just copy and paste each line one at a time and paste them into our terminal. Now, if you're using Windows Terminal, you can actually use the standard Windows copy and paste shortcuts. Control V. All right, onto the merge settings. All right, so we have our final settings here. Let's run through what actually we are doing here instead of just blindly copying and pasting commands. So the first line sets up a diff tool within Git. So once that diff tool called P4Merge is registered with Git, we can then attach settings to that diff tool, which is named P4Merge. The first setting for that is path, and that's simply the path to the executable for P4Merge. That's for the diff tool. I also like disabling the prompt. So if you were to just say get diff, typically if you specified the diff tool for running a diff within Git, you would normally get prompted to confirm running that external program. Setting the prompt to false disables that behavior. Onto the merge tool. Very similar settings. We set up the merge tool registered as P4Merge, then attach the path setting to the merge tool named P4Merge. Again, to that specific executable. Then there's also a merge tool prompt, which we also want to disable. And finally, there's a keep backup, which I also set the false. Now, if you want to play around, you can change these settings to whatever you want. All right, let's make sure all of these settings are actually registered with our .gitconfig file. Git config --global -e. Now here's the final state of our .git config file. We go ahead and close out of our text editor and do a bit of cleanup. So I can close the terminal and our web browser.